And welcome back to In the Can. We have the executive producer and the author of the book that inspired the documentary Slavery by Another Name, Douglas Blackmon, with us. Welcome, Doug. How are you?
Great. Glad to be here.
And you're in an interesting position because you wrote a Pulitzer Prize winning book in 2009 of the same name.
Right.
Obviously critical acclaim, well received, but then all of a sudden we see a documentary on it. So taking something from documentary form in print and moving it to the screen, how does that work?
Well, I was imagining a film coming out of this project from the very beginning, which began more than 10 years ago when I started researching some of this stuff. In fact, I worked with a filmmaker, very unfortunate filmmaker, early on who followed me around during some of the research process, but I took so long to write the book that she finally ran out of money and energy.
That never happened.
Died.
So, right.
But when finally I finished the book and won the Pulitzer, there were several different groups that were interested in doing a film on it, and I was able to pair together two of them, sort of take the creative people of one group, led by Sam Pollard, legendary documentarian and director, and then a great production company, TPT Productions, and sort of put them together, and I really ended up with sort of a dream team of collaborators.
Well, let's talk about the book a little bit. The idea is here that anybody who knows their history knows that the slaves were freed during the Civil War era, and that's all we know, and away we go. But there's more of a story to it than that, and you tell it kind of over many decades.
Exactly. We all learned it. I learned it too, and particularly growing up in the South. I grew up in Mississippi, and so the story that we all learned was that the Civil War was fought, and Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves,
and that was it.
And that was it. And then
40 acres and a mule.
40 acres and a mule, and then a long, tough time for black people. Not getting to vote, being called a bad name, poverty, but then a sort of mysteriously African Americans being sort of stuck in poverty for this long period of time. And a lot of Americans came to conclude, I mean, as offensive as it really sounds, that that was just how it was going to work out, that was just destiny almost for African Americans. And what the book is about and what the film captures is that that's really not what happened. What happened was that slavery of one kind ended, and after the Civil War, a new kind of slavery was created. And African Americans, really millions of African Americans, had their lives circumscribed by that for the next 50, 60, 70 years, depending on where you're talking about, right up to the beginning of World War II.
And a lot of people say that slavery still exists, but they mean it in a metaphoric way. But you're talking about, I mean, literal forced work.
I'm talking about slavery.
Servitude, serfdom even,
Exactly. Slavery's not a word that should be thrown around casually.
Right.
And people do that too much. There are a lot of other words that work for really bad things. But slavery is when a person is being forced to work without compensation, against their will, and even more so when they are at risk of being bought and sold. That's slavery. And that's what we're talking about here. Thousands and thousands of people who were forced into slavery and back into a system that, in many respects, was worse than what was happening before the Civil War.
So you documented this and told that story in the book.
Right.
Making a film, obviously the film A to Z is not going to be the same as the book A to Z. What did you learn as the film came out and kind of had more of a three-dimensional look at your story?
Well, the great opportunity of the film was that these were people who, by and large, were illiterate and impoverished and didn't leave thousands of letters, obviously didn't leave any moving images of them, in many cases no images at all, of thousands of people who were worked to death or had other terrible things happen to them. And so I spent many years just trying to excavate the barest details of certain people's lives, but tried to write the book in a way that would restore some sense of humanity to these people who had just become names and maybe not even that.
Well, just by telling their story,
exactly.
I mean, that does that for
some respect to the fact that these were not just poor people who were worked to death. These were people who had loves and lives and the favorite songs, and these were real people with families and real dimension to their lives that was destroyed, but about which there was almost no outrage. And so the challenge in the film was to do the same thing, even more dramatically. And so Sam, the director, I think really brilliantly pulled off these reenactments, but that are very carefully done reenactments where there's no words in the film coming from the mouths of the actors are not documented. There's nothing invented in the film.
You didn't over-dramatize it.
We didn't over-dramatize it, and there were some limits to what we could do because of the paucity of information. But in the handful of the major characters in the film who we portray, we did have letters or testimony that they gave in court hearings, and so we were able to give them a voice, and then through the film they had the opportunity to finally come alive. And for me, after years and years of searching for every shred of information, particularly about this one central character in the film, a young man named Green Cottenham, who was worked to death in a slave mine in 1908. And I spent years trying to bring Green to life. And then when we set out to make the film, the most magnificent thing to me was one day on set, I got to meet Green Cottenham. I cast him, in fact. There was this group of actors there who were all going to be forced laborers in a series of scenes, and Sam Pollard said to me, well, Doug, you should decide who's Green here. And it was just this extraordinary experience of finally seeing the flesh and blood of someone representing this figure I pursued like a ghost for almost 10 years at that point.
Well, yeah, and extraordinary also for everybody involved, too, because you're bringing life to an old story that maybe just was nothing more than just words on a paper at one point, but then you start seeing faces and emotions, and maybe some of the actors had some interesting experiences, too.
Oh, you should have seen these young African-American men when they get arrested in these scenes, when they're seized by a sheriff or they're kidnapped, and to find themselves being placed in cuffs and chains and shackles, and these young guys were, they were really, a number of them were really emotionally impacted by that.
Well, Doug, we appreciate you coming in. The film is still screening. I think we got one more screening. If you're watching this right now, you can make the 12 o'clock?
That's right.
Where's it playing at?
At the Temple Theater.
Temple Theater, which is a great venue, by the way, for this film. Thanks for coming in. Doug Blackmon, he's the executive producer, the author of the book that inspired the documentary Slavery by Another Name. We have more in the can after this. Stay tuned.